Blessed Easter to each and every one. He is risen, and he's risen indeed. And I'm coming to you today from Israel, and Michael W. Smith is joining me here in just a few moments.
Dr. Franklin Graham, a name synonymous with faith, hope, and unwavering dedication to spreading the gospel, has shocked the world with a heartbreaking announcement. For decades, he has faithfully carried on the legacy of his father, the legendary Billy Graham, reaching millions with powerful sermons and compassionate humanitarian work. But now, in an unexpected twist, Dr. Graham has revealed that he is saying goodbye. His decision has left followers around the globe stunned, sparking countless questions and speculations. Why is he stepping away now? What could have led to this surprising and tragic decision? Join us as we uncover the truth behind Dr. Franklin Graham's emotional announcement and explore the reasons for his shocking departure from the public eye. Franklin Graham, now a prominent Christian leader and preacher, is often regarded as a figure who has carried on the legacy of his famous father, Billy Graham, one of the most influential evangelists of the 20th century. However, Franklin's path to embracing his faith and taking up his father's mantle was far from a straightforward journey. His early years were marked by rebellion, resistance to expectations, and a profound struggle with his identity in the shadow of his father's towering reputation. Growing up in Billy Graham's shadow. Born on July 14, 1952, Franklin Graham was the second of 4 children to Billy and Ruth Graham. From the beginning, Franklin's life was anything but ordinary. His father's ministry was a global phenomenon, attracting millions of followers and influencing the spiritual lives of people across the world. Billy Graham was not only known for his powerful preaching, but also for his role as an advisor to U.S. presidents and his organizing of large-scale crusades, where thousands of people gathered to hear the message of salvation. By the time Franklin was a child, his father had already become a cultural and spiritual icon, respected by political leaders, business magnates, and millions of ordinary people alike. For young Franklin, however, the immense public adoration of his father was both a source of pride and, paradoxically, a source of great pressure. While his father was known for his evangelistic zeal and unwavering commitment to spreading the gospel, Franklin was wrestling with the weight of living up to expectations that felt almost impossible to meet. Billy Graham's life was characterized by a steadfast commitment to faith, morality, and public service. This created an environment in which Franklin, though gifted in his own right, struggled with his sense of self-worth and identity. As a child, Franklin had to grapple with the fact that his every action was being scrutinized, not just as an individual, but through the lens of being the son of Billy Graham. Franklin's rebellion and the struggles of adolescence. During his adolescence, Franklin Graham became increasingly resistant to the expectations placed upon him. He openly described himself as a bad boy during his teenage years, a period of rebellion that seemed to define much of his early adulthood. While many sons of public figures feel the weight of their parents' legacies, Franklin's resistance went beyond mere frustration. It was an outright rejection of the image others had of him. Growing up in such a high-profile family, Franklin often felt overshadowed by his father's towering public persona. Billy Graham was a figure who inspired awe, respect, and reverence. The thought of stepping into his father's shoes and being compared to a man whose influence spanned continents was overwhelming. Franklin confessed that the idea of entering the pulpit, the very place where his father had preached for decades, made him feel as though he would be nothing more than a living reminder of the comparisons people would inevitably make between him and his father. "I just felt that if I put myself into the pulpit, that it would be like a lightning rod for all these comparisons," he admitted later in life. As a result of this pressure, Franklin began to rebel against the ideals his parents had tried to instill in him. His adolescence was marked by behavior that starkly contradicted the values of faith morality, and discipline his father had preached. He smoked cigarettes, drank alcohol, and even got into physical fights. The young Franklin also experimented with drugs, admitting that he had tried marijuana. These actions stood in direct opposition to the image of virtue and holiness that his father was known for, creating a rift not just between Franklin and his father's followers, but also between Franklin and his own internal compass. Parental struggles and the absence of Billy Graham. While Franklin's rebellion was a source of personal turmoil, it also posed a challenge for his parents, particularly for his mother, Ruth Graham, who was the primary figure in the lives of Franklin and his siblings. While Billy was often away for his crusades, Ruth, though a loving and devoted mother, had to manage the difficult dynamics of raising children in the absence of her husband. Billy's ministry required him to travel extensively, often leaving his family for months at a time. During these long absences, Ruth became the rock of the family, ensuring that her children had structure and discipline, despite the absence of their father's direct influence. For Franklin, this absence was a double-edged sword. On one hand, he admired his father, but also felt abandoned by him. On the other hand, his father's absence meant that Franklin could act out in ways that went unnoticed. Ruth's steady influence and faith in God shaped the family, but Franklin's rebellious streak led him to feel like an outsider in his own family. He became disillusioned with the pressures of being the son of someone so widely revered. He began to feel like an outcast in the world his father had created, a world that placed immense expectations on him that Franklin was simply unwilling to meet. The turning point: a father's call. In 1974, at the age of 22, Franklin's life began to take a profound turn. At this time, Franklin was living a reckless lifestyle, indulging in the vices that had defined his younger years. It was during this period that Billy Graham took Franklin on a trip to Switzerland. The two had an honest, heart-to-heart conversation, during which Billy expressed his deep concern for his son's spiritual well-being. Looking Franklin in the eye, Billy said words that would forever change Franklin's life. "I want you to know that your mother and I sense there is a struggle for the soul of your life, and you're going to have to make a choice." These words hit Franklin deeply. He would later reflect that it was in that moment that he realized he was at a crossroads. The weight of his father's words all hung heavy over him as he continued his travels through Europe. While Franklin still wasn't ready to change, those words had planted a seed in his heart that would later bear fruit. For the time being, Franklin continued with his reckless lifestyle, traveling with a bottle of scotch in hand and maintaining habits that were at odds with the faith his parents had raised him in. However, Franklin's life would take another unexpected turn, one that would ultimately lead him back to faith and the realization that he could no longer run from God. A divine revelation in Jerusalem. While in Jerusalem during the same trip to Europe, Franklin's life reached a decisive turning point. He was alone in a hotel room one evening when, instead of heading to the bar as he would have in the past, he felt an inexplicable pull towards the Bible. Franklin began reading the Gospel of John, and as he read, something powerful happened. When he reached chapter 3, where Jesus tells Nicodemus that he must be born again, Franklin realized that these words were not just for others, they were for him. "I realized for the first time that this message was for Franklin Graham," he wrote in his autobiography, Rebel with a Cause. "I had to be born again." This moment marked the beginning of Franklin's transformation. It was as though the scales had fallen from his eyes, and for the first time, he understood the personal nature of faith. This wasn't about living in the shadow of his father's legacy or seeking to meet the expectations of others. It was about Franklin Graham making a personal commitment to Christ. This transformative experience in Jerusalem set the foundation for Franklin's eventual path to ministry. It was the moment when he stopped running from God and began to embrace his faith fully. New beginnings, marriage, and a new purpose. Shortly after his life-changing encounter in Jerusalem, Franklin returned to North Carolina, where he married Jane Austen Cunningham, a woman from his hometown. Their wedding took place on the front lawn of his parents' house, and it was during this ceremony that Franklin publicly declared his transformation. He made it clear to everyone that both his heart and his life had changed. It was a moment of renewal, where Franklin embraced not just his faith, but also a new direction for his future. Following his marriage, Franklin was introduced to Bob Pierce, a family friend who was the founder of Samaritan's Purse, an international Christian relief organization. Pierce invited Franklin to join him on a 6-week mission trip to Asia, where Franklin saw the harsh realities of life for some of the world's poorest people. The trip left a profound impact on Franklin, deepening his desire to serve others and bringing him closer to his faith. Seeing children living in abject poverty and families struggling without food, clean water, or medical care stirred something in Franklin. It strengthened his resolve to help people in need, and he began to see how his life could make a real difference in the world, taking the helm at Samaritan's Purse. After Bob Pierce's death in 1978, Franklin assumed leadership of Samaritan's Purse, taking over as the president and chairman of the organization. Under Franklin's leadership, Samaritan's Purse grew exponentially. Franklin's commitment to serving people in crisis, whether due to famine, war, or natural disaster, became the cornerstone of his ministry. He often worked in dangerous and difficult conditions, traveling to war-torn countries and regions ravaged by natural disasters. Unlike his father, who preached to vast crowds in large stadiums, Franklin was committed to a more personal, hands-on approach to ministry. His efforts to serve those in need, often in some of the most challenging parts of the world, set him apart from his father's more traditional approach. Franklin famously said, "I'm going to travel the gutters and the ditches of the world and help people in the name of Jesus Christ." For him, this was about reaching out to those who had been forgotten by the world, often going into the most neglected corners of the globe to provide aid and hope. A new ministry path. In 1989, Franklin's life took another significant turn. At the urging of a friend, John Wesley White, he agreed to preach at a crusade in Juneau, Alaska. After delivering his sermon, Franklin realized that God was calling him to step into the role of preacher, something he had resisted for years. Franklin recognized that his refusal to preach had been driven by pride and fear of comparison to his father. This experience marked the beginning of Franklin's commitment to preach alongside his father in large crusades, although he continued to focus much of his time on the hands-on work of Samaritan's Purse. The transition of leadership. In the early 2000s, as Billy Graham's health declined due to Parkinson's disease, the question of who would carry on his ministry became a pressing concern. Despite initial skepticism from some quarters about Franklin taking over, his growth in faith and leadership gradually earned him the trust of both the ministry's supporters and his father's legacy. In 2000, Franklin Graham was officially named the CEO of the Billy Graham Evangelistic Association, marking the beginning of a new chapter in his life. A chapter in which he would continue his father's work, but in his own way, with his own calling. Thus, Franklin Graham's journey, from rebellious youth to global Christian leader, reflects a remarkable transformation. It is a story of personal redemption, deep faith, and a dedication to serving the world in the name of Christ. His life's work, while forever connected to his father's legacy, is also uniquely his own, defined by a calling to help the forgotten and the suffering, while carrying the message of the gospel to a world in need. A legacy of faith and rebellion. Franklin Graham was always aware of the monumental shadow cast by his father, Billy Graham, one of the most respected figures in Christian evangelism. Billy Graham's ministry spanned decades and touched millions around the world. From massive crusades to his counsel to U.S. presidents, Billy Graham was a symbol of unwavering faith, humility, and service. For Franklin, however, This legacy came with its own set of expectations, pressures, and struggles. While Billy was known for his gentle demeanor and devotion to preaching, Franklin was often the opposite: outspoken, rebellious, and resistant to following in his father's footsteps. In his youth, Franklin found himself rebelling against the conservative values that were at the heart of his family's ministry. While his father was a paragon of virtue and discipline, Franklin experimented with smoking, drinking, and even drugs during his teenage years. His wild behavior was a direct rejection of the expectations that came with being Billy Graham's son. This internal struggle created a rift between Franklin and the faith that defined his family. It wasn't until he was in his 20s, during a transformative trip to Europe, that Franklin began to truly understand his personal relationship with God. His father's gentle guidance, coupled with Franklin's own search for meaning, eventually led him to a renewed commitment to Christianity. However, the decision to embrace his faith was not easy, as Franklin had to find his own voice and sense of purpose separate from his father's towering legacy. Franklin takes the reins, the transition to leadership. By the time Franklin took on the leadership roles of Samaritan's Purse and the Billy Graham Evangelistic Association, he had undergone a personal transformation. Yet, despite his newfound faith and commitment to service, Franklin's journey was fraught with challenges. One of the most significant hurdles was the question of leadership succession within the Graham family. Many questioned whether Franklin, known for his fiery nature, was truly capable of continuing his father's mission with the same level of grace and effectiveness. For some, the idea of Franklin stepping into the role of the leader of the BGEA seemed like an impossible feat. But over time, Franklin proved himself to be more than capable of managing these large organizations. His leadership injected new energy and direction into the ministries. While his father had been known for large-scale televised crusades, Franklin focused much of his efforts on humanitarian work through Samaritan's Purse. This organization, founded by Franklin's father's friend Bob Pierce, focused on providing aid to impoverished communities worldwide, and Franklin embraced the organization's mission as a core part of his calling. Franklin's leadership was marked by a desire to address some of the world's most pressing needs. Whether it was sending aid to victims of war, natural disasters, or famine, Franklin demonstrated his commitment to not just preaching the gospel, but living it out through action. Yet, this approach also required him to reconcile his father's more traditional approach with his own, more hands-on practical ministry style. The controversial salary, a question of ethics. Despite his growing influence and positive impact, Franklin Graham's leadership was not without controversy. One of the most significant and contentious issues that emerged in the early years of his leadership was the question of his compensation. In 2009, it was revealed that Franklin was receiving salaries from both Samaritan's Purse and the Billy Graham Evangelistic Association, the two organizations he led. The combined salary for these roles in 2008 was a staggering $1.2 million, a figure that raised eyebrows, especially given the nonprofit nature of the work. The controversy was exacerbated when it became known that part of this salary came from retirement contributions that Franklin had been required to re-report due to a new IRS regulation. This created the perception that Franklin was benefiting excessively from two major nonprofit organizations, despite the fact that his compensation was in line with IRS guidelines. Critics questioned whether it was ethical for one individual to hold such high-paying roles at two large organizations, especially when both organizations relied heavily on donations. In response to the growing backlash, Franklin Graham made significant changes. He chose to forego his salary from the Billy Graham Evangelistic Association, acknowledging the concerns surrounding his compensation. In doing so, he sought to demonstrate that his commitment to ministry was not driven by financial gain. Furthermore, he decided to suspend his contributions to his retirement plans, pledging to redirect those funds toward ministry efforts until the economy recovered. Despite these efforts to address the criticisms, The issue resurfaced in 2015 when it was revealed that Franklin had resumed taking a salary from the BGEA. This time, however, his salary was even higher than before, sparking new criticism from both the public and nonprofit experts. The debate centered on whether his salary was justified given the size of the organizations he led and the resources at their disposal. Franklin maintained that his work was about service and fulfilling his calling, not financial gain. Nonetheless, the controversy over his compensation remained a point of tension for many. Political controversies. A divisive stance. Beyond his financial controversies, Franklin Graham has also found himself embroiled in political debates that have drawn significant attention and criticism. One of the most notable instances of political controversy occurred in 2011, when Franklin Graham openly endorsed Donald Trump for president, despite Trump's unconventional behavior and polarizing public image. Franklin's endorsement surprised many, particularly because of Trump's personal history and his controversial statements on issues related to race, religion, and gender. Franklin's strong support for Trump only intensified as the 2016 election approached, with Franklin becoming one of the president's most vocal evangelical supporters. His advocacy for Trump was rooted in his belief that Trump was a defender of Christian values and religious freedom, particularly in a country where some felt the Christian principles were under attack. This stance, however, divided many within the evangelical community. Some agreed with Franklin's position, seeing it as a way to support a president who aligned with their values, while others felt uneasy about associating with a figure whose behavior and rhetoric were often criticized as divisive. Franklin's support for Trump deepened during the president's time in office. He was outspoken in defending Trump against the impeachment proceedings in 2019, calling the efforts politically motivated. In a later interview, Franklin even suggested that the opposition to Trump came from demonic forces, a statement that was seen as extreme by many, particularly those within the political and religious spheres who were critical of the president. The tension between Franklin Graham and his father's legacy came to a head when Christianity Today, the magazine founded by Billy Graham, published an editorial calling for Trump's removal from office. The editorial was critical of Trump's character and conduct, leading to a public rift between Franklin and the publication. Franklin argued that his father would have supported Trump, pointing to the fact that Billy Graham had voted for him in the 2016 election. This sparked a wider conversation within the evangelical community about the intersection of faith and politics, with Franklin defending his position as a stand for Christian values in a time of moral uncertainty. LGBTQ+ controversy, protests and cancellations. Franklin Graham's political views were not the only source of tension during his tenure as a public figure. In 2020, he planned a tour across the UK, with stops in 8 cities, including Liverpool. However, his planned tour faced significant opposition, particularly from LGBTQ+ activists who were outraged by Graham's past remarks about LGBTQ+ issues. Franklin had made several controversial statements over the years regarding homosexuality, and many saw his views as discriminatory. The protests against Graham's tour were particularly vocal in cities like Liverpool, where local leaders, including Mayor Joe Anderson, publicly rejected Graham's message. They argued that his views were harmful and could lead to division and hostility. As a result of these protests, many of the venues that had initially agreed to host Franklin Graham's events began to cancel his bookings, stating that his presence was not in line with their values of inclusivity and respect for all people. Franklin's organization, in response to these cancellations, threatened legal action against the venues, arguing that their contracts had been breached. Despite these efforts, Franklin's planned UK tour was canceled, and his message of Christian values, particularly regarding the LGBTQ+ community, was thrust into the spotlight once again. The controversy highlighted the ongoing tensions between religious leaders like Franklin Graham and LGBTQ+ activists, as well as the broader public debate about freedom of speech, religious beliefs, and the rights of marginalized communities. Franklin Graham. Today, a family man and faithful leader. Today, Franklin Graham lives in Boone, North Carolina, with his wife, Jane Austen Cunningham, and their 4 children. Despite the demands of his leadership roles, Franklin is committed to spending time with his family and ensuring that his personal life remains rooted in faith and family values. He has often stated that his commitment to ministry is not about fame or fortune, but about being faithful to the gospel message that his father preached for decades. As a leader, Franklin Graham continues to navigate the complexities of his role, balancing the legacy of his father with his own vision for the future of the BGEA and Samaritan's Purse. His leadership has been marked by both success and controversy, but through it all he remains dedicated to his mission of spreading the Christian message of hope, love, and faith. Despite the challenges he has faced, Franklin Graham has shown resilience and determination in continuing the work that his father began, using his platform to bring attention to issues of global suffering and faith. For Franklin Graham, the ministry is about more than just maintaining a family legacy. It is about fulfilling a divine calling that has shaped his life and work. Whether addressing humanitarian crises or navigating the tumultuous waters of public opinion, Franklin's life and leadership reflect a deep commitment to faith, service, and the gospel message. He continues to serve as a voice for Christianity, using his position to spread a message of hope to the world.